Autumn leaves drifted across the manicured lawn of Whitmore and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. Emma Richardson clutched her black purse tighter as she approached the imposing brick building, her heels clicking against the cobblestone walkway. The crisp October air bit at her cheeks, but the chill she felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the hollow ache of losing the most important person in her life. 3 weeks had passed since her grandfather, William Richardson, had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87. The man who had raised her after her parents' car accident when she was 12, who had taught her everything from chess strategies to business ethics, was gone. The funeral had been a blur of condolences and flowers, but today would bring finality to his affairs. Emma paused at the entrance, smoothing down her navy dress. Her grandfather had always insisted she dress professionally for important occasions. "Presentation matters, Emma," he would say with his warm smile, adjusting his own perfectly knotted tie. "People form opinions in the first 3 seconds. Make sure yours counts." The lobby buzzed with quiet activity as attorneys and clients moved through the marble-floored space. Emma approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "I'm Emma Richardson. I have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore regarding my grandfather's will." "Of course, dear. Please have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." Emma settled into a leather chair, her mind wandering to the last conversation she'd had with her grandfather. They'd been sitting in his study, surrounded by first-edition books and family photographs, when he'd grown unusually serious. "Emma, I need you to promise me something," he had said, his weathered hands folded over his walking cane. "When the time comes, and you're dealing with my affairs, remember that I've always been 3 steps ahead. I've seen how people can change when money enters the picture." At the time, she dismissed it as the ramblings of an elderly man concerned about his legacy. Now, those words seemed more prophetic than paranoid. "Miss Richardson?" A tall man in an expensive suit approached. "I'm Charles Whitmore. Please, follow me." The conference room was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Common. A long mahogany table dominated the space, and Emma was surprised to see several people already seated. Her heart sank when she recognized her uncle, Richard, her grandfather's younger brother, sitting at the far end with his wife Margaret and their son, David. Richard Richardson had always been the black sheep of the family. Where her grandfather had built his wealth through decades of hard work and real estate development, Richard had burned through multiple business ventures and investments, always looking for the quick score that never materialized. The two brothers had maintained a polite but distant relationship, seeing each other mainly at holidays and family gatherings. "Emma," Richard stood as she entered, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "So good to see you, sweetheart. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to talk since the funeral." Margaret, a thin woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, offered a brief nod. David, their 25-year-old son, looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact entirely. "Uncle Richard," Emma replied, taking a seat across from them. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Well, family business concerns all of us, doesn't it?" Richard's tone was casual, but there was something underneath it that made Emma's stomach tighten. Charles Whitmore took his place at the head of the table, opening a thick manila folder. "Now that everyone is here, we can proceed with the reading of William Richardson's last will and testament." He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "William was very specific about his wishes, and I'll read them exactly as written." Emma folded her hands in her lap, trying to focus on the lawyer's words despite the growing tension in the room. Her grandfather had been methodical about everything in life. She expected his final arrangements would be no different. "To my beloved granddaughter, Emma Richardson, who has been like a daughter to me since the tragic loss of my son Michael and daughter-in-law Sarah, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes the family home at 1247 Beacon Hill Road, all investment portfolios, business holdings, and personal property, valued at approximately $12 million. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. She'd known her grandfather was comfortable, But $12 million was beyond anything she'd imagined. Across the table, she noticed Richard's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She has shown remarkable character, intelligence, and compassion throughout her 26 years. Whitmore continued reading. I trust her completely to carry on the Richardson family legacy with honor and integrity. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Emma's eyes filled with tears, not from the money, but from her grandfather's. Final words of love and trust. Now, Whitmore continued, there are a few smaller bequests. To my brother Richard Richardson, I leave my collection of first edition novels and the sum of $50,000, with the hope that he will find peace and purpose in his remaining years. Richard's face had gone pale, then flushed red. Margaret placed a restraining hand on his arm, but he shook it off. That's it? Richard's voice cracked. $50,000 and some old books? Mr. Richardson, please allow me to finish. No. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. William wasn't thinking clearly in his final years. Everyone knows that. He was on medication, confused half the time. Emma's mouth fell open. Uncle Richard, that's not true. Grandpa was sharp until the very end. His doctor said what he was paid to say. Richard's voice rose. You manipulated an old man, Emma. You were the only one around. Him, filling his head with lies about his own family. That's enough. Emma stood, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You're grieving, and you're saying things you don't mean. Grieving? Richard laughed bitterly. I'm the one who should be grieving. I'm his brother, his only living relative besides you. I've been part of this family for 62 years, and I'm being dismissed like hired help. Margaret finally spoke, her voice sharp with indignation. Richard has a point, Emma. You barely visited William until recent years. You were off playing career woman in New York while Richard was here, checking on him regularly. Emma felt a surge of anger, but kept, her voice level. I moved back to Boston 2 years ago specifically to spend time with Grandpa. And I called him every single day when I was in New York. Called him. David finally spoke up, his tone accusatory. Phone calls aren't the same as being present. Charles Whitmore tapped his pen against the table. If I may, this is highly irregular. The will is legally binding and was executed when Mr. William Richardson was of sound mind and body. There were witnesses present, and his mental capacity was verified by his physician. Richard turned to face the lawyer directly. I'm contesting this will. William wasn't competent when he signed it, and I have reason to believe Emma used undue influence to manipulate the contents. Emma's hands began to shake. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I deserve my fair share of the family estate. William and I built the original business together back in the 70s. I may not have stayed involved, but I was there in the beginning. You left the business because you wanted to pursue your own ventures, Emma replied, her voice gaining strength. Grandpa told me the whole story. He bought out your share fair and square, with money that should have stayed in the family. Richard slammed his fist on the table. Every dollar of that estate contains my sweat and blood, too. Margaret nodded vigorously. Richard has been struggling financially for years, Emma. You're young. You have your whole career ahead of you. Richard deserves security in his golden years. Emma looked around the room in disbelief. So this is what this is about? Money? Everything is about money, Richard said coldly. And family should take care of family. William forgot that in his final years. Charles Whitmore cleared his throat. Mr. Richardson, you certainly have the right to contest the will, but I should warn you that doing so will be expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, Mr. William Richardson was very specific about his mental state and his reasons for his bequests. I don't care how expensive it is, Richard replied. I'll mortgage my house if I have to. This isn't right. And everyone in this room knows it. Emma felt tears stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from the shock of seeing her uncle's true character. The man who had bounced her on his knee as a child, who had taught her to ride a bicycle, was now looking at her with genuine hatred. "Uncle Richard, please," she said softly. "Let's talk about this privately. Maybe we can work something out." "Work something out?" He laughed harshly. "You mean throw me a few scraps from your $12 million windfall?" "I don't think so, Emma. I want what's rightfully mine." "What exactly do you think is rightfully yours?" Emma's voice grew firmer. "Half. At minimum. William was my brother before he was your grandfather. Family blood means something." The room fell silent again. Emma stared at her uncle, trying to reconcile this angry, entitled man with the person she thought she knew. Margaret and David watched the exchange with hungry eyes, clearly supporting Richard's position. Charles Whitmore shuffled through his papers. "I understand emotions are running high, but the will is quite clear. Unless there's evidence of fraud or incompetence, which I assure you there isn't, this document will stand up in any court." "We'll see about that," Richard muttered, but some of the fight had gone out of his voice. Emma felt a strange calm settling over her. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "I've always been 3 steps ahead." She thought about the sealed envelope he'd given her just days before his death, the one sitting in her apartment that she hadn't yet opened because it felt too final. "Uncle Richard," she said quietly, "I loved Grandpa more than anything in this world. He raised me, supported me, and taught me everything I know about being a good person. The idea that I would manipulate him for money is not only insulting, it's impossible. He was the strongest, smartest man I've ever known, and he made his choices based on a lifetime of watching how people behaved." Richard's face softened slightly, but Margaret's expression remained hard. "Pretty words, Emma, but actions matter more, and your actions isolated William from his own family." "That's not true," Emma replied firmly. "Grandpa had an open door for everyone. You were always welcome at the house. The reason you didn't visit more often had nothing to do with me." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe we should all just calm down and think about this rationally." "There's nothing to think about," Richard said, his resolve returning. "I'm filing a contest tomorrow morning. Emma, I hope you're prepared for a long legal battle, because I'm not backing down." Emma looked at her uncle, really looked at him, and saw a man consumed by bitterness and financial desperation. She thought about the conversation she'd had with her grandfather about Richard's gambling debts, his failed investments, his increasingly frequent requests for loans that were never repaid. "If that's what you feel you need to do," she said finally, "then do it. But I won't let you destroy Grandpa's memory or our family with lies and accusations." Charles Whitmore began gathering his papers. "I think this is a good place to conclude today's reading. Mr. Richard Richardson, if you intend to contest the will, please have your attorney contact my office. Miss Emma Richardson, please schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss the estate administration." As everyone prepared to leave, Richard approached Emma one more time. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Emma, it doesn't have to be this way. We're family. We can work together." Emma studied her uncle's face, seeing glimpses of the man she'd once loved and trusted. For a moment, she almost wavered, but then she remembered her grandfather's words about people changing when money entered the picture. "Uncle Richard," she said gently, "we are family, but what you're asking me to do isn't about family. It's about money. And I won't dishonor Grandpa's final wishes because you're having financial problems." Richard's expression hardened again. "Then you've made your choice." "Don't expect this to be easy, Emma. By the time my lawyers are done, everyone will know exactly what kind of person you really are." As the Richardson family members filed out of the conference room, Emma remained seated, staring out the window at the changing leaves in Boston Common. The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, and she wondered if her grandfather had somehow known this moment would come. That evening, Emma sat in her small apartment in Back Bay, holding the sealed envelope her grandfather had given her. The thick cream paper felt substantial in her hands, and her name was written across the front in his distinctive handwriting. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. At the top, in her grandfather's careful script, were the words, "For Emma, when the wolves show their teeth." As she read the contents, Emma's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in determination. Her grandfather hadn't just been 3 steps ahead. He'd been playing an entirely different game. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Emma's apartment as she sat at her kitchen table, rereading her grandfather's letter for the 5th time. The coffee in her mug had grown cold, but she barely noticed. Each word seemed to carry more weight with every reading, and she was beginning to understand the full scope of what her grandfather had discovered and planned for. Her phone buzzed, with a text message from her best friend Sarah Chen, whom she'd known since college. "Saw the news about your grandfather's will online. Are you okay? Call me." Emma frowned, quickly opening her laptop and searching for news about the Richardson estate. Her heart sank as she found multiple articles on local news websites with headlines like "Beacon Hill Heiress Faces Family Challenge" and "Richardson Estate Battle Brewing." Someone had leaked details from yesterday's reading to the press. Her phone rang immediately. "Sarah? Emma? Honey, are you all right? I just read the most ridiculous article claiming your uncle is contesting your grandfather's will." "It's true," Emma said, running her hand through her dark hair. "Richard stood up in the lawyer's office yesterday and basically accused me of manipulating Grandpa. He wants half the estate. That's insane. Your grandfather adored you. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you two together could see that." Emma walked to her living room window, looking out at the busy street below. "The worst part is seeing how money changes people. I never would have believed Uncle Richard could be so cruel. What are you going to do?" Emma glanced at the letter, still spread on her kitchen table. "I'm going to follow Grandpa's instructions. He saw this coming, Sarah. He knew exactly what would happen." "What do you mean?" "I can't explain right now, but there's more to this story. Much more." After hanging up, Emma dressed carefully in a charcoal gray business suit, another lesson from her grandfather about the importance of appearance in serious situations. She had 3 important stops to make today, and each one would bring her closer to understanding the full picture her grandfather had painted for her. Her first destination was the law office of Patricia Hernandez, a family law attorney her grandfather had recommended in his letter. The office was located in a converted brownstone in the South End, and Patricia herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and an immediate, reassuring presence. "Emma Richardson," Patricia said as they settled into her office. "Your grandfather spoke of you often. I'm so sorry for your loss. You knew Grandpa? William was a client of mine for several years, though not for the reasons you might expect." "Please, sit down. We have quite a bit to discuss." Emma took the offered chair, noticing the thick file folder labeled "Richardson, William" on Patricia's desk. "Your grandfather came to see me about 3 years ago," Patricia began. "He was concerned about certain irregularities he'd discovered regarding your Uncle Richard's financial situation. William asked me to conduct a discreet investigation." "What kind of irregularities?" Patricia opened the file and withdrew several documents. "It appears your uncle has been engaging in some questionable financial practices, gambling debts, unpaid loans, and some concerning business partnerships. But more relevant to your current situation, William discovered that Richard had been forging his signature on several occasions." Emma's mouth fell open. "Forging his signature? On what?" "Small things initially. A few checks here and there. always under amounts that wouldn't trigger bank scrutiny. Your grandfather's accountant noticed discrepancies during a routine audit and brought them to William's attention. Did Grandpa confront Uncle Richard about this? No. William was very strategic. He wanted to gather all the evidence first before taking any action. He suspected the forgeries were just the tip of the iceberg. Patricia pulled out a folder of photocopied checks. These are copies of 17 forged checks totaling nearly $40,000, all cashed by Richard over the past 2 years. The handwriting analysis is conclusive. Emma stared at the documents, feeling sick. Why didn't Grandpa tell me about this? He didn't want to burden you with family drama while he was still alive, but he was very clear that if Richard ever challenged his will, you should have all the facts about his character. Is this enough to... can we use this? Patricia smiled grimly. Oh, we're just getting started. Your grandfather also had me investigate Richard's business dealings. Are you familiar with Coastal Development Partners? Emma shook her head. It's a real estate investment company that Richard started with 2 partners about 5 years ago. On paper, it looks legitimate. In reality, it's been operating as something closer to a Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors. How do you know all this? William hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb. Marcus has been tracking Richard's activities for over 2 years. The documentation is extensive. Emma felt overwhelmed. I don't understand. Why would Grandpa go to such lengths? He and Uncle Richard weren't close, but this seems... Your grandfather loved his brother, Emma. But he also understood that Richard was heading down a dangerous path, one that could potentially destroy innocent people, including you. William wanted to protect both his legacy and his family. Patricia handed Emma another folder. These are financial records showing that Richard has been systematically approaching your grandfather's elderly friends and business associates, trying to convince them to invest in Coastal Development Partners. He's been using the Richardson family name and his relationship to William as selling points. Emma flipped through the documents, seeing familiar names of people she'd known since childhood. Mrs. Whitman from down the street, Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez, who owned the corner market. Oh my God. These are all family friends. Exactly. People who trusted Richard because they trusted your grandfather. Several have already lost significant amounts of money. Does Uncle Richard know that Grandpa knew about all this? We don't believe so. William was very careful to keep his investigation secret. Richard likely assumes these activities are still hidden. Emma leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything. So, when Uncle Richard challenges the will, we'll be ready with a complete picture of his character and motivations. A man who has been stealing from his own brother and defrauding. Elderly investors will have a difficult time convincing a judge that he deserves a larger inheritance. But Patricia, I don't want to destroy my uncle. Despite everything, he's still family. Patricia's expression softened. Your grandfather anticipated you would feel that way. He left very specific instructions about how he wanted this handled. The goal isn't to destroy Richard. It's to protect you and stop him from hurting more innocent people. Emma's second stop was to meet Marcus Webb, the private investigator. His office was in a nondescript building in downtown Boston, and Marcus himself was a stocky man in his early 60s, with intelligent gray eyes and calloused hands that spoke of practical experience. Miss Richardson, he greeted her. Your grandfather was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Patricia Hernandez said you've been investigating my uncle for over 2 years? Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to sit across from his cluttered desk. Your grandfather was very thorough. He didn't just want to know about Richard's current activities. He wanted to understand the pattern of behavior that led to them. What did you find? Marcus opened a thick binder. Richard Richardson has been in financial trouble for most of his adult life, but it's gotten much worse in recent years. He owes money to some very unpleasant people. What kind of people? Loan sharks, underground gambling operations. The kind of people who don't take "I'll pay you next week" as an acceptable answer. Emma felt a chill. Are you saying Uncle Richard is in danger? I'm saying Richard is desperate. Desperate people make dangerous choices. Marcus flipped to a section marked with red tabs. 3 months ago, Richard approached someone about the possibility of having your grandfather's will changed through unofficial means. You mean illegally? I mean, he asked a contact if they knew anyone who could forge legal documents or create a fake will. The conversation was recorded. Emma's hands trembled slightly. You recorded my uncle talking about forging Grandpa's will? I didn't record it. Richard's contact did, as insurance. The man Richard approached was actually an undercover FBI agent working on a separate case. When Richard's name came up in our investigation, the agent shared the recording with us. Marcus played a brief audio clip on his computer. Emma heard her uncle's voice clearly. The old man won't listen to reason about the will. I need something that shows I'm entitled to at least half. Can it be done? The recording continued with Richard discussing payment and logistics for creating fraudulent documents. Emma felt sick listening to her uncle casually planning to defraud her and dishonor her grandfather's memory. There's more, Marcus said gently. Richard has been telling people around town that your grandfather was showing signs of dementia in his final months. He's been building a narrative to support his will contest. But that's completely false. Grandpa was sharp until the very end. No. I spoke with his doctors, his housekeeper, his accountant, and several friends. Everyone confirms that William Richardson was mentally acute right up until his death. But Richard has been planting seeds of doubt for months. Emma stared out the window at the bustling city below. Why would he do this? I mean, I understand he needs money, but to go this far... Your grandfather wondered the same thing. That's why he had me dig deeper into Richard's past. Marcus turned to another section of the binder. What I found explains a lot about Richard's current behavior. What do you mean? Did you know that Richard was engaged to be married in 1987? Emma thought for a moment. I remember hearing something about that when I was little, but I thought it was just a brief relationship. It was serious. He was engaged to a woman named Linda Castellano. They had been together for 3 years and were planning a wedding. What happened? Marcus pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1987. Linda's family owned a successful chain of restaurants. When they learned about Richard's gambling problems and mounting debts, they convinced Linda to break off the engagement. It was a very public humiliation for Richard. I don't understand how this relates to the current situation. Linda Castellano married someone else 6 months later. Her new husband was a real estate developer, a direct competitor of your grandfather's business at the time. Emma began to see the connection. Uncle Richard blamed Grandpa for the broken engagement? More than that. Richard became convinced that your grandfather had intentionally sabotaged his relationship with Linda to eliminate business competition. It wasn't true, but Richard believed it. Marcus showed her more documents. After the broken engagement, Richard's gambling and drinking escalated. He made a series of increasingly poor business decisions, always convinced that your grandfather was somehow working against him behind the scenes. So this isn't really about the inheritance? Oh, it's about the money. Richard desperately needs it. But it's also about 35 years of accumulated resentment and blame. In Richard's mind, your grandfather owes him for ruining his life. Emma felt a deep sadness settling over her. And now, he's transferring all that anger to me. Unfortunately, yes. Richard sees you as the symbol of everything he believes your grandfather took from him. Success, family, security, respect. What happens now? Marcus closed the binder. That depends on what you want to do with this information. Your grandfather left very specific instructions, but ultimately, the choice is yours. Emma's final stop of the day was the most emotionally difficult, her grandfather's house on Beacon Hill. She hadn't been back since the funeral, and walking through the front door felt like stepping into a museum of memories. The house was exactly as her grandfather had left it. His reading glasses still sat on the side table next to his favorite armchair. The latest issue of the Wall Street Journal lay folded on the coffee table, and the study still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. Emma made her way to the study, where she and her grandfather had spent countless hours discussing everything, from literature to business ethics. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and his massive oak desk dominated the space. Following the instructions in his letter, Emma went to the bookshelf and located a first-edition copy of The Great Gatsby. Behind it, she found a small key taped to the shelf. The key opened a drawer in the desk that she'd never known existed. Inside the drawer was another envelope, thicker than the first, along with a small digital recorder and several USB drives. The envelope was marked, "For Emma, the full truth." Emma sat in her grandfather's leather chair and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated just 1 week before his death. "My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, then Richard has done exactly what I expected him to do. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I've been watching my brother's descent for many years now, and I understand the man he has become. The investigation files you've received from Patricia and Marcus tell part of the story, but there's something else you need to know. Something that will be difficult to hear, but necessary for you to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Richard approached me 6 months ago with a proposition. He wanted me to change my will to leave him half the estate. When I refused, he became increasingly aggressive in his arguments. During our final conversation on this topic, he made threats, not just against me, but against you. The digital recorder in this drawer contains that conversation. I began recording our phone calls after he started making veiled threats about accidents that could happen to elderly people who don't listen to reason. Emma, I need you to understand that Richard is not just desperate for money, he has become dangerous. The private investigator's report shows that he has connections to some very unsavory people, and I believe he would go to extreme lengths to get what he thinks he deserves. However, there is one more thing Richard doesn't know, something that changes everything about his claim to the family estate. Look in the large safe behind the painting of our family. The combination is your birth date, month, day, year. Inside, you'll find documents that prove Richard Richardson is not actually my brother. Emma's hand shook as she read the final paragraph. She looked up at the family portrait hanging above the fireplace, a formal photograph taken when she was 16, showing her with her grandfather and uncle at a family gathering. With trembling hands, she moved the painting aside, revealing a wall safe. She entered her birth date, October 15th, 1998, and the safe clicked open. Inside were adoption papers dated 1962, showing that the boy who became Richard Richardson was actually Richard Morrison, adopted by her great-grandparents when he was 3 years old. His biological parents had been killed in a factory accident, and the Richardson family had taken him in as an act of charity. There was also a birth certificate showing that Richard Morrison was born 6 months after the official Richardson family, records claimed, meaning he had been lying about his age his entire life. More importantly, there were DNA test results that her grandfather had apparently ordered shortly before his death, confirming that Richard shared no blood relation to the Richardson family. Emma sank back into the leather chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Her uncle, the man who was claiming his birthright to the family fortune, wasn't actually part of the family at all. The final document in the safe was a letter from her grandfather explaining his decision to keep Richard's adoption secret. Never told Richard the truth about his origins because I didn't want him to feel like an outsider. Our parents raised him as their own son, and I always considered him my true brother, regardless of blood. But when he began making threats and demands based on family blood, I realized he needed to understand the reality of his situation. I had hoped to have this conversation with him directly, but his increasingly erratic behavior made me concerned for both my safety and yours. Richard has built his entire identity around being a Richardson, and learning the truth may push him over the edge. Use this information wisely, Emma. The goal is not to hurt Richard, but to protect yourself and preserve the family legacy that You alone have the right to inherit." As Emma sat in the growing darkness of the study, she realized her grandfather hadn't just been 3 steps ahead. He'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. But the next move was hers to make, and the stakes had never been higher. Outside, the first leaves of autumn continued to fall, and Emma wondered if her family would survive the storm that was coming. The offices of Morrison, Blake and Associates buzzed with morning activity as Emma arrived for her meeting with Richard's attorney. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Boston high-rise, and everything about the environment screamed expensive legal firepower. Emma clutched her briefcase tighter, knowing that inside were documents that could end the will, contest immediately, but also destroy her uncle's life in the process. She'd spent the previous evening agonizing over her grandfather's revelations. The adoption papers sat on her kitchen table like a loaded weapon, and she'd called Sarah 3 times just to hear a friendly voice. Each time, she'd come close to revealing the truth about Richard's parentage, but something held her back. "Miss Richardson?" A young associate approached her in the marble lobby. "Mr. Blake is ready to see you now." Emma followed the associate through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished attorneys and into a corner office with panoramic views of Boston Harbor. Thomas Blake was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning high-stakes legal battles. "Miss Richardson, please have a seat. I understand this is a difficult situation for your family." Emma settled into a leather chair across from Blake's imposing desk. "Mr. Blake, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me directly. I was hoping we could resolve this matter without a lengthy court battle." Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her with shrewd eyes. "I'll be frank with you, Miss Richardson. Your uncle has retained our services because he believes there are serious irregularities with your grandfather's will. We've already begun preliminary investigations that suggest your grandfather may not have been competent when he executed the document." "What kind of investigations?" "We've spoken with several witnesses who observed your grandfather exhibiting signs of confusion and memory loss in his final months. We've also uncovered evidence suggesting you may have isolated him from other family members during the period when the will was drafted." Emma felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. "Mr. Blake, I think you've been misinformed. My grandfather was mentally sharp until the day he died, and I never prevented anyone from visiting him." Blake opened a file folder. "We have sworn affidavits from 3 individuals stating that William Richardson seemed confused during conversations in the months before his death. We also have phone records showing that you called him multiple times daily, which could be interpreted as excessive influence. I called him because I loved him and wanted to make sure he was okay. There's nothing suspicious about a granddaughter checking on her elderly grandfather." "Perhaps not. But the frequency and timing of your calls, combined with witness testimony about his declining mental state, creates a picture that will be compelling to a jury." Emma realized that Richard's attorney was trying to intimidate her with manufactured evidence and legal theatrics. She thought about her grandfather's advice regarding negotiation. "Never let them see your strongest cards until you're ready to play them. Mr. Blake, what exactly does my uncle want?" "Mr. Richard Richardson believes he's entitled to 50% of the estate. He's prepared to settle for 40% to avoid the time and expense of litigation. And if I refuse?" Blake's smile was cold. "Then we proceed to court, where a jury will hear testimony about an isolated elderly man being manipulated by his only heir. Frankly, Miss Richardson, will contests are unpredictable. Even if you ultimately prevail, the legal fees and negative publicity could cost you millions." Emma opened her briefcase and withdrew a single folder. "Mr. Blake, before we discuss settlements, I think you should be aware of some information that's come to light regarding my uncle's recent activities." Handed him copies of the forged checks that Patricia Hernandez had provided. Blake examined them with growing concern. "These appear to show forged signatures on checks drawn from your grandfather's accounts," Emma said calmly. "The handwriting analysis confirms they were forged by Uncle Richard." Blake's confident demeanor faltered slightly. Where did you obtain these documents? My grandfather had been aware of the forgeries for some time. He chose not to prosecute because Richard is family, but he kept detailed records of every incident. Emma provided additional documents showing the pattern of fraud, the total amount stolen, and the dates of each occurrence. As you can see, this continued right up until my grandfather's death. The final forged check was cashed just 3 days before Grandpa passed away. Blake studied the documents in silence. Emma could practically see him recalculating the strength of Richard's case. There's more, Emma continued, handing him the folder containing Marcus Webb's investigation. My grandfather hired a private investigator to document Uncle Richard's business dealings. What they found is quite disturbing. Blake flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read about coastal development partners and the elderly investors who had lost money. Your client has been operating what amounts to a Ponzi scheme, Emma said quietly. He's defrauded multiple senior citizens, many of whom were my grandfather's friends. He used the Richardson family name to gain their trust. These are serious allegations, Blake said. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Emma leaned forward. Mr. Blake, I'm not here to threaten or intimidate anyone, but I think you should understand the full picture before advising your client to proceed with litigation. A will contest would inevitably bring all of these activities into public view. Blake closed the folder and looked directly at Emma. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that Uncle Richard withdraw his contest and accept the bequest my grandfather left him. In return, I won't pursue criminal charges for the forged checks, and I won't expose his fraudulent business practices. And if he refuses? Emma's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. Then we go to court, and a jury learns everything about Richard Richardson's character and motivations. I don't think that serves anyone's interests. Blake was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. I'll need to discuss this with my client. Of course. But Mr. Blake, there's one more thing you should know. Emma paused, thinking about the adoption papers still locked in her briefcase. My grandfather left very detailed records of many things. If this case goes to trial, there may be additional revelations that would be difficult for everyone involved. After leaving Blake's office, Emma drove to her uncle's house in Newton, a modest 2-story colonial that had seen better days. The lawn needed mowing, and several shutters hung at odd angles. It was a stark contrast to the well-maintained homes in the neighborhood, and Emma realized this was likely another sign of Richard's financial struggles. Margaret answered the door, her expression immediately hostile. Emma, I suppose you're here to gloat. I'm here to talk to Uncle Richard. Is he home? He's in his workshop, but I don't think he wants to see you. Emma stepped inside, despite Margaret's obvious reluctance. The house felt cramped and cluttered, with stacks of unopened mail on the hallway table and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke. It was a far cry from the organized, welcoming atmosphere of her grandfather's home. She found Richard in the converted garage, hunched over a workbench, where he was half-heartedly sanding a piece of wood. He looked up when she entered, and Emma was shocked by his appearance. He'd lost weight since the funeral. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Emma. His voice was flat, emotionless. Come to offer me another insulting settlement? I came to talk. Just the two of us. Richard set down his sandpaper and turned to face her fully. Talk about what? How you turned my own brother against me? How you poisoned an old man's mind? Emma pulled up a dusty stool and sat down, trying to make the conversation feel less confrontational. Uncle Richard, I never said a word against you to Grandpa. Not once. Then why? Richard's voice cracked, with emotion. Why would he leave me practically nothing after 60 years of being his brother? Emma looked around the cluttered workshop, seeing decades of unfinished projects and abandoned dreams. Maybe because he knew you needed to find your own way. Maybe because he understood that money wouldn't solve your real problems. Don't psychoanalyze me, Emma. You don't know what it's been like, always being compared to William, always falling short. You're right, I don't know. But I do know that Grandpa loved you. He talked about you all the time. About teaching you to fish. About your first job. About how proud he was when you started your own business. Richard laughed bitterly. Proud? He thought I was a failure. Everyone knew it. That's not true. He was disappointed when your businesses didn't work out. But he was never ashamed of you for trying. Easy words, Emma. But actions speak louder. $50,000 after a lifetime of being his brother. Emma took a deep breath, knowing she was about to step into dangerous territory. Uncle Richard, I know about the checks. Richard's face went pale. What checks? The ones you forged with Grandpa's signature. 17 of them over 2 years, totaling almost $40,000. Richard slumped against his workbench, suddenly looking much older than his 62 years. He knew? He knew everything. The forged checks, Coastal Development Partners, the investors you've been defrauding. He had it all documented. Then why didn't he? Richard's voice trailed off. Why didn't he have you arrested? Because despite everything, he still loved you. But he also couldn't let you continue hurting innocent people. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Those investors. I was going to pay them back. I just needed time to make the investments work. Uncle Richard, you know that's not how it works. You were using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors. That's the definition of a Ponzi scheme. I was desperate. The words came out as barely a whisper. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The people I owe money to. They're not patient people. Emma felt a chill. What people? Richard looked up at her with eyes full of fear and shame. I got in deep with some bad people, Emma. Gambling debts that kept growing. They gave me ultimatums. What kind of ultimatums? Pay up or face consequences. Not just for me, but for my family. Richard's voice was hollow. They know where David works, where Margaret shops. They made it very clear that my debts could become everyone's problem. Emma began to understand the full scope of her uncle's desperation. How much do you owe? Including interest and penalties. About $600,000. Emma felt sick. Uncle Richard, why didn't you come to Grandpa for help? He would have found a way. I tried. I asked him for loans a dozen times over the years. Sometimes he'd give me something small, but never enough to really solve the problem. And every time he'd lecture me about responsibility and making better choices. Maybe because he could see that just giving you money wasn't solving anything. Richard stood up abruptly, pacing around the small workshop. So instead, he decides to teach me a lesson by leaving everything to you? That's supposed to help me become a better person? Emma remained seated, trying to project calm. I think he hoped you'd find another way. A legitimate way. There is no other way. Richard's voice rose. Don't you understand? Without a significant inheritance, I'm a dead man. These aren't people who accept payment plans. There has to be something we can do. Some way to what? You going to give me half the estate out of the goodness of your heart? Emma considered this seriously. Maybe we could work something out. Not half, but enough to help you get back on your feet. Richard stopped pacing and stared at her. You'd do that? If you withdraw the will contest and agree to get help for your gambling problem, yes. I'd consider providing enough money to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start. For a moment, hope flickered in Richard's eyes. Then his expression hardened again. What's the catch? No catch, but there would have to be conditions. Professional help for your addiction, complete transparency about your finances, and restitution to the people you've defrauded through Coastal Development. Richard was quiet for a long moment. How much are we talking about? $1 million. Enough to pay your debts, make things right with your investors, and have something left over to start fresh. And all I have to do is admit I'm a gambling addict and a fraud? Emma's voice was gentle but firm. Uncle Richard, you are a gambling addict and a fraud. The question is whether you want to stay that way, or get help to become something better. Richard slumped back onto his stool, looking defeated. I've been lying to myself for so long, Emma. Telling myself I could fix everything if I just had one more chance, one more big score. But you can fix it, not with gambling or schemes, but with honesty and hard work. What if I can't? What if I'm just too far gone? Emma stood and placed her hand on her uncle's shoulder. Then at least you'll go down fighting instead of lying, and you'll have a chance to make things right with the people you've hurt. Richard looked up at her with tears in his eyes. Why would you help me after everything I've done? Because despite everything, you're still family. And because I think Grandpa would want me to give you a chance to redeem yourself. Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I need to think about this. And I need to talk to Margaret and David. Take all the time you need. But Uncle Richard, there's something else you should know. Emma opened her briefcase and withdrew the recording device her grandfather had left her. Grandpa recorded your phone conversations after you started making threats. I have recordings of you talking about having accidents, arranged for elderly, people who don't listen to reason. Richard's face went white. Emma, I never meant. I was just angry and scared. I would never actually hurt anyone. I believe you. But if this case goes to trial, those recordings will become evidence. Combined with everything else, they would destroy any sympathy a jury might have for your situation. Richard buried his face in his hands. God, what have I become? Emma sat back down, her voice compassionate but serious. You've become someone who lost his way, but it's not too late to find it again. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment reviewing all the evidence her grandfather had compiled. The forged checks, the fraudulent business dealings, the recorded threats, and finally, the adoption papers that proved Richard wasn't even a biological Richardson. She thought about her grandfather's final letter, where he'd written, Use this information wisely, Emma. The goal is not to hurt Richard, but to protect yourself and preserve the family legacy. But what was the family legacy really? Was it the money and property, or was it something deeper? The values of compassion, integrity, and second chances that her grandfather had tried to instill in her. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was David, her cousin. Emma? It's David. We need to talk. Of course. What's on your mind? My dad told me about your conversation today, about your offer to help him. Emma waited, unsure what David's reaction would be. I wanted you to know that I've been trying to get him to seek help for years. His gambling problem has been tearing our family apart. I didn't realize you knew about it. It's been hard to miss. The money problems, the mood swings, the lies about where he's been and what he's been doing. David's voice was heavy with exhaustion. My mom and I have been walking on eggshells for years. What do you think about my offer? I think it's more generous than he deserves, but it might be his last chance to turn things around. Emma was surprised by David's candor. Are you okay with him withdrawing the will contest? Emma, that will contest was never about fairness or family rights. It was about feeding his addiction and paying off dangerous people. If you can help him break that cycle, you'd be saving his life. And you're okay with me inheriting everything? David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Grandpa was right to leave everything to you. You're the only one in this family who has your head on straight. After hanging up, Emma made her decision. She would offer Richard the help she'd promised, but she would also keep the adoption papers as insurance. If he accepted her offer and genuinely tried to change, those papers would remain her secret forever. But if he betrayed her trust, or returned to his old patterns, she would have the ultimate proof that his claim to the Richardson legacy was built on a lie. As she prepared for bed, Emma thought about her grandfather's wisdom in preparing for every contingency. He'd given her the tools to protect herself, while also providing a path for Richard's redemption. The choice of which path to take would ultimately be Richard's, but Emma would be ready for whatever he decided. Outside her window, the lights of Boston twinkled in the darkness, and Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just the inheritor of her grandfather's fortune. She was the guardian of his legacy and the keeper of his final lesson about family, forgiveness, and the true cost of greed. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold in Boston, with a thin layer of frost covering the windows of Emma's apartment. She stood at her kitchen counter, sipping coffee and reading the final version of the settlement agreement that Patricia Hernandez had drafted. After 3 weeks of negotiations, phone calls, and family meetings, they had reached an accord that would end the will contest and, hopefully, give Richard Richardson the chance at redemption he desperately needed. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Big day today. You've got this. Proud of how you've handled everything." The settlement meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Charles Whitmore's office, the same conference room where this whole ordeal had begun 2 months earlier. Emma dressed carefully in a navy blue suit, choosing her grandmother's pearl earrings for luck. As she prepared to leave, she paused at her kitchen table where the sealed envelope containing Richard's adoption papers still lay untouched. She had decided that some secrets were meant to remain buried. Richard's identity crisis and feelings of inadequacy had driven much of his destructive behavior over the years. Learning that he wasn't biologically a Richardson might destroy what little self-worth he had left, making recovery even more difficult. Her grandfather had kept the secret for over 60 years out of love. Emma would continue that tradition. The conference room was already occupied when Emma arrived. Richard sat with his attorney, Thomas Blake, looking haggard but more alert than he had in weeks. Margaret and David flanked him, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. Across the table, Charles Whitmore and Patricia Hernandez had arranged stacks of documents with the precision of experienced negotiators. "Good morning, everyone," Emma said as she took her seat. "I hope we can make this a positive day for our family." Richard looked up at her with eyes that were clearer than she'd seen them in months. "Emma, before we begin, I need to say something." The room fell silent. Richard cleared his throat and continued. "I owe you an apology. What I did, the accusations, the will contest, the things I said about you manipulating Grandpa, none of it was true, and I knew it even as I was saying it." Emma nodded encouragingly. "I appreciate that, Uncle Richard. I was scared and desperate, and I let that turn me into someone I didn't recognize. You deserved better from me, and so did William's memory." Margaret reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "We both owe you an apology, Emma. I supported Richard's accusations because I was angry about our financial situation, but that was no excuse for attacking your character." David spoke up next. "I want to apologize too. I knew Dad was struggling with gambling, but I was too embarrassed to admit it. I should have spoken up during that first meeting instead of letting things escalate." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you all for saying that. It means more than you know." Charles Whitmore opened the first folder. "Shall we proceed with the settlement terms?" Patricia Hernandez took the lead. "The agreement we've reached addresses several key points. First, Richard Richardson formally withdraws all challenges to William Richardson's will and acknowledges its validity." Richard nodded. "I'm withdrawing the contest completely." "Second," Patricia continued, "in recognition of the family circumstances and Richard's commitment to rehabilitation, Emma Richardson has agreed to provide financial assistance beyond what was stipulated in the original will." Thomas Blake consulted his notes. "My client will receive a total of $1.2 million to be paid in structured installments over 3 years. The first payment of $400,000 will be made today to address immediate debts and obligations. Emma had increased her original offer after learning more about Richard's situation. The additional money would ensure he could not only pay off his gambling debts, but also fully compensate the elderly investors who had lost money in Coastal Development Partners. Third, Patricia said, Richard Richardson agrees to enter a residential gambling addiction treatment program within 30 days, followed by ongoing counseling and participation in Gamblers Anonymous. I've already been accepted at Hazelden, Betty Ford Foundation, Richard said quietly. I start their program next Monday. Fourth, Richard will make full restitution to all investors in Coastal Development Partners, with the amounts and payment schedule overseen by a court-appointed monitor. Emma had insisted on this provision. The elderly friends of her grandfather who had lost money deserved to be made whole, regardless of the cost. And finally, Patricia concluded, this agreement includes a comprehensive non-disclosure clause. The details of William Richardson's investigation into Richard's activities, as well as the circumstances of this settlement, will remain confidential to protect all parties involved. Emma had fought for this provision as well. She didn't want her uncle's mistakes to become public knowledge, both for his family's sake and to preserve her grandfather's reputation as someone who handled family matters with discretion and compassion. Thomas. Blake looked at his client. Richard, do you understand and agree to all these terms? Richard straightened in his chair. I do, and I want everyone to know that I don't take this generosity lightly. Emma, you're giving me a chance I don't deserve, and I won't waste it. I believe in second chances, Uncle Richard, but more importantly, I believe in you. Charles Whitmore produced the official documents. If everyone is in agreement, we can execute the settlement and transfer the initial payment today. As they signed the papers, Emma thought about her grandfather's final letter and his hope that this situation could be resolved without destroying the family completely. He had understood that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in crushing your opponents, but in finding a way for everyone to walk away with their dignity intact. After the legal formalities were completed, the family gathered in the lobby of the law office. The tension that had dominated their interactions for months had finally lifted, replaced by something that felt like hope. Emma, Margaret said, approaching her with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for our family. You don't need to thank me. We're family, and family helps each other. David hugged his cousin tightly. Grandpa would be proud of how you handled this. You showed real wisdom and compassion. Richard hung back, clearly struggling with his emotions. When Emma approached him, he looked down at his feet. I'm ashamed of the man I became, Emma. The lies, the stealing, the threats, none of that was who I wanted to be. Uncle Richard, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. I'm scared. What if I can't change? What if the treatment doesn't work? Emma placed her hand on his arm. Then you'll try again. And if that doesn't work, you'll try again after that. Recovery isn't a destination, it's a journey, and you don't have to take it alone. Richard embraced his niece, and for the first time in months, Emma felt like she had her uncle back. Not the desperate, frightened man who had challenged the will, but the person she remembered from her childhood who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with math homework. 3 weeks later, Emma sat in her grandfather's study, now officially her study, reviewing the quarterly reports from the family investment portfolio. She had decided to keep the Beacon Hill house as her primary residence, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings and the connection to her grandfather's memory. The doorbell rang, and Emma was surprised to find Marcus Webb, the private investigator, standing on her front porch. Miss Richardson, I apologize for dropping by unannounced. I have some information I thought you should hear directly. Emma invited him into the study and offered him coffee. Marcus settled into the chair across from her grandfather's desk, looking uncharacteristically serious. I've been monitoring Richard's situation as part of our ongoing investigation, he began. The people he owed money to, they've been paid, in full. and they've agreed to leave him alone permanently. That's good news. It is. But there's something else. Before Richard entered treatment, he did something I didn't expect. Marcus pulled out a folder. He contacted every single investor in Coastal Development Partners personally, not through lawyers or intermediaries. He called each one individually to apologize and explain what had happened. Emma was surprised. He wasn't required to do that under the settlement agreement. No, he wasn't. But according to the people I spoke with, he spent hours on the phone with each investor, taking full responsibility for their losses and explaining how he had deceived them. Several of them said they were impressed by his sincerity. Marcus handed her a letter. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, your grandfather's neighbor, asked me to give this to you. Emma recognized the name. Mrs. Whitman had been one of the largest investors in Richard's scheme, losing nearly $30,000. She opened the letter and read, Dear Emma, your Uncle Richard called me yesterday to apologize for what he had done. He spent over an hour on the phone with me, explaining how his gambling addiction had led him to make terrible choices. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what he had done. He simply took full responsibility and expressed genuine remorse. I want you to know that while I was angry about losing my money, I was even more hurt by the betrayal of trust. Your grandfather was my dear friend, and knowing that his brother had used that friendship to deceive me was heartbreaking. But after talking with Richard, I believe his remorse is genuine. He's clearly a man who lost his way and is now trying to find it again. The fact that you chose to help him instead of destroying him speaks volumes about the kind of person your grandfather raised you to be. Your grandfather would be proud of both of you, Richard for having the courage to face his mistakes, and you for showing the wisdom to offer redemption instead of revenge. With admiration and gratitude, Eleanor Whitman, Emma set the letter down, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Has he been calling all the investors? Every single one. And according to my sources at Hazelden, he's been doing well in treatment. His counselors say he's one of the most engaged patients they've had. No denial, no resistance to the program, just genuine commitment to change. Marcus stood to leave. Miss Richardson, I've been investigating people for over 30 years, and I've learned to spot the difference between genuine remorse and manipulation. Your uncle is the real deal. Whatever you said to him during your private conversation, it got through. After Marcus left, Emma walked through the house, thinking about the journey that had brought her family to this point. The past few months had tested every principle her grandfather had taught her about integrity, compassion, and the true meaning of family. She paused in front of the family portrait in the living room, looking at the image of herself with her grandfather and uncle taken just 2 years earlier. At the time, she never could have imagined the crisis that was coming, or the choices she would have to make. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Richard, calling from treatment. Emma, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Of course not. How are you doing? Better. It's hard work, but I'm starting to understand how I got to such a dark place. The counselors here have helped me see that my gambling wasn't just about money. It was about trying to prove something to myself and everyone else. What do you mean? Richard's voice was thoughtful. I spent my whole life feeling like I was in William's shadow. He was successful, respected, admired by everyone who knew him. I kept trying to find shortcuts to that same success, but every shortcut led me further away from the person I wanted to be. Emma sat down in her grandfather's chair. Uncle Richard, Grandpa never expected you to be him. He just wanted you to be the best version of yourself. I know that now. And I'm starting to understand that the person I am, flaws and all, has value. I don't need to be William Richardson to be worth something. You've always been worth something. The gambling and the schemes were just distractions from who you really are. Emma, I want you to know that what you've done for me, giving me this chance, it's changed everything. Not just the money, but the trust you showed in me. I won't forget it. I know you won't. And when you're ready, you'll have a family waiting. For you." After hanging up, Emma opened her laptop and began drafting a letter to the board of directors of the Richardson Family Foundation, a charitable organization her grandfather had established years earlier. She had decided to use part of her inheritance to expand the foundation's mission, to include programs for gambling addiction treatment and financial literacy education. It seemed like the perfect way to honor both her grandfather's legacy and her uncle's journey toward redemption, turning a family crisis into an opportunity to help others facing similar struggles. As the winter sun set over Boston, casting long shadows across the Beacon Hill house, Emma reflected on the lessons of the past few months. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood or money. It was about the choices people made when faced with difficult circumstances. Her grandfather had chosen to protect his family even from beyond the grave, providing Emma with the tools she needed to navigate the crisis while still offering hope for reconciliation. Richard had chosen to face his demons and work toward redemption rather than continuing down a path of self-destruction. And Emma had chosen compassion over revenge, understanding over judgment. The hidden clause her grandfather had referenced in his final wishes wasn't a legal document. It was a clause written on his heart, one that said family was worth fighting for, even when that fight meant helping someone find their way back from the darkness. 6 months later, Emma stood in the same law office where the ordeal had begun, but this time she was there for a celebration. Richard had successfully completed his residential treatment program and 6 months of intensive outpatient therapy. All the Coastal Development Partners investors had been fully repaid, and Richard had begun working as a counselor at a local addiction treatment center. The final piece of business was the transfer of the remaining settlement funds to Richard, along with the signing of documents establishing the Richardson Family Recovery Fund, which would provide scholarships for gambling addiction treatment. "I have to admit," Charles Whitmore said as they concluded the paperwork, "in 40 years of practicing law, I've never seen a family dispute resolved with such dignity on all sides." Richard, looking healthier and more at peace than Emma had seen him in years, turned to his niece. "Emma, I know I can never fully repay what you've done for me, but I want you to know that I'm committed to spending the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the trust you placed in me." "You already are." "Worthy of it, Uncle Richard. You always were." As they left the law office together, Emma thought about her grandfather's final lesson. He had understood that the true measure of a family's legacy wasn't in the money they accumulated or the property they owned. It was in their capacity to love, forgive, and help each other become better people. The hidden clause he had left behind wasn't written in legal language or filed with attorneys. It was written in the hearts of the people who loved him, a clause that said family means never giving up on each other, no matter how far they fall or how much they lose their way. And, in the end, that clause had changed everything.